Britain's Conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good afternoon. It's 4 minutes past 12 on LBC. I've made it through 2 hours so far without saying good evening, which I usually do when I'm presenting in the morning or afternoon. But it's great to have your company. And I think one of the things we want to do in the next hour is really delve into this issue of Russian oligarchs in the UK, the Russian money that is, this phrase is always used, swilling around the city of London. We're getting a lot of criticism in this country now from other European countries saying, look, you're not acting fast enough on oligarchs. We're doing it. Why aren't you? And I have to say, I can't explain that. I don't really understand why that is. The argument that the government uses is, well, we can't just go around seizing assets. We don't want to be a country that does that. Germany has done it. They've seized various yachts from various oligarchs. But Boris Johnson says we've got to get our legal ducks in a row before we take action against some of them. I want to learn why that is, if that is a valid reason or if it's covering something else up. I don't know, but we have got with us a man who does. Bill Browder is with us for the next hour. He's going to take your calls. He's an anti-corruption campaigner, chief executive of Hermitage Capital and head of the Magnitsky Global Justice campaign. Bill, welcome. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say on all of this. Now, James O'Brien's listeners are very familiar with you. You're on his programme quite a lot. But just for this audience that maybe aren't as familiar with you, just tell us your backstory a little bit.
Sure. So I'm an American, born in America, come from an unusual American family. My grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party. And so in my teenage years...
Popular guy then.
Yeah. No, it was a pretty lonely place for him to be. But in my teenage years, in my rebellion, I decided to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And I graduated Stanford Business School in the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, I said, well, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And I eventually moved to Russia. I set up an investment fund, which I succeeded. I became the largest, at least foreign investor in Russia, with $4.5 billion invested in the country, coming from institutional investors here. And in the process, I discovered that all the companies I was investing in were being robbed blind by these oligarchs. And I decided that it was really immoral and also unprofitable to be robbed blind. And so I tried to fight it. And I started to expose the corruption in the companies. And as you can imagine, that didn't make me a very popular person. And I lived there after 10 years of living there. I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security. And then really terrible stuff started happening. My offices in Moscow were raided. They seized all of our documents. I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate, and he discovered that the documents they seized were used in a very complicated fraud in which government officials and police officers and organized criminals worked together to steal $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government in the previous year. So they weren't stealing from me. They were taking my documents to steal from their own government, $230 million. And they got away with it. And Sergei discovered it, and as a young patriot, he decided to expose it and testify against the officials involved, thinking that, of course, the government would be unhappy to learn that a bunch of their money was stolen. But instead of making him a hero and going after the culprits, the Russian government allowed the culprits he testified against to arrest him. They put him in pretrial detention. They tortured him for 358 days. And they murdered him in Russian police custody on November 16, 2009. And I got the news on the next day, and it was the most heartbreaking, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. And I put aside all of my business activities and have, for the last 12, almost 13 years now, I have become a full-time justice activist, going after the people who killed him to make sure that they face justice.
And you've had a huge effect on governments all around the world.
Well, what's happened was that at first I thought maybe we could even get justice in Russia. Sergei had documented everything that had happened to him up until the last night of his life. And so we had this unbelievable granular record of horror. And we submitted that to various law enforcement authorities in Russia. We told that we went to the media, and very much like we're seeing on television right now, it's like black is white, white is black. Instead of going after the people who killed Sergei, they put Sergei on trial. It was the first time in the history of Russia they put a dead man on trial. I was his co-defendant. They found us both guilty, and they couldn't do anything more to him. They sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. So it was obvious there was no chance of justice in Russia. So we said, well, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And that's when I came up with this idea, which is these people killed him for money. And they don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in the West. You can see it all over London. You can see it in Saint-Tropez. You can see it in New York City. They would send their kids to boarding schools here and in Switzerland. They send their parents to doctors on Harley Street. And we might not be able to prosecute them for torture and murder in Russia, but we can certainly freeze their assets and not allow them to travel.
So how do you differentiate between a good oligarch and a bad oligarch? Is there such a thing as a good oligarch?
For the most part, no. I mean, there's one or two, and the only way you can define that is if they've gone to jail to fight against Putin, effectively. And so what's happened is, are these people, all evil from in the core of their soul? No. What's happened is that they're faced with a choice. They can either become part of the criminal regime of Vladimir Putin and keep their money and do his bidding and hold his money for him, or they can go to lose their money, go to jail, go into exile, etc. And so most of these people took the choice to say they're going to go for the criminal option. And so when we see these people, and they're all protesting in their innocence right now, none of them are innocent because they had to do terrible things in order to keep their money. And, maybe, deep down in their heart, they don't feel good about it, but they made those choices, and they made those choices for money.
So why is it that the British government seems not to be able to act as swiftly as other European governments in freezing people's assets, ejecting them from the country, stopping their children attending British schools and universities?
Well, that's a big question. Let me touch on different parts of it. So the British government today can cancel everybody's visa who they want. That doesn't require
even if they've become British citizens.
Well, if they become British citizens, well, as we all know, there's a woman sitting in a Syrian camp who had Bangladeshi parents, and they took away her citizenship, and so it's entirely possible. But let's put aside the citizenship thing and just unpack this slowly. Coming to this country is a privilege, not a right. It can be canceled in 2 seconds. All the wives, children, parents, and themselves can, if they're not citizens, can be sent home. And most of them are not citizens. So that's an easy thing to do. And then the second thing to do is they could easily put these people on a sanctions list today if they wanted to. And I know that because I created a law called the Magnitsky Act here in the UK and many other countries around the world, which allows them, it was named after my lawyer who was murdered that I just told you about, and it allows them to freeze the assets and ban the visas of people who are involved in human rights abuse or corruption. And so putting aside whether they're close to Vladimir Putin or far away from Vladimir Putin, whether they're involved in Ukraine or not, if we can show that they're involved in corruption, then they can have their assets frozen. We know, and it's come out of the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, court documents, journalistic investigations, we know a lot of these ones can be proven to be involved in corruption. So we could today put them on the sanctions list and no delay. The fact that there is a delay raises a lot of very troubling questions about whether this government is serious about going after these Russians.
Liz Truss, I think last night, tweeted, "We're coming after you." I mean, tough language, and we've heard this before. And they have sanctioned quite a lot, but not as many as America, not as many as EU countries. They say they have to get their legal ducks in a row. Now, that sounds a perfectly plausible reason. Is it?
Well, the answer is yes. You don't want to sanction somebody without having the right evidence because, these are billionaires. They're going to hire lawyers who are going to, pick apart every sentence and every document to try to challenge the government. And they've succeeded in Europe after the invasion of Crimea. a number of Russians were sanctioned and Ukrainians. In fact, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, remember the guy with the golden toilets and all that crazy stuff in his totally corrupt Russian-backed president of Ukraine? He was on the sanctions list, on the EU sanctions list, and somehow, and I don't know what he did, he was able to challenge it legally and get out of it. So we don't want to put people on the sanctions list and have them get out of it. But I mean, if for some reason, this is a national emergency we're facing, and if for some reason they don't have the resources or the skills inside the government to do this, then they should deputize the best lawyers. The one thing this country has no shortage of is unbelievably good, expensive lawyers. And
one thing we're good at,
and pay them whatever they're asking, because this is a national emergency. This is something where if we don't get it right now, we're going to be facing much worse situations later.
Okay, right. We've had the context. So we'll come to your calls in just a moment. Your calls to Bill Browder, 0345 6060 973. It's 12:15.
This is LBC. This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 18 minutes past 12. Andrew is in Stockton-on-Tees. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Ian. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
As we've just heard, Bill, Putin's quite happy to murder people who speak out against his regime. Do you think oligarchs having their financial stability threatened by sanctions is enough to entice them to turn on him and take that risk? And secondly, would an oligarch rebellion be enough to bring Putin down?
It's a good question, and something that I talk about with everybody. They say, like, shouldn't the oligarchs be rising up? And the answer is, of course, they should be. I mean, their wealth has been destroyed. They're completely, ostracized and made into pariahs. But you have to understand that these people are all existing at the pleasure of Vladimir Putin. At any point, he can take all their money away, take away their freedom, and kill them. And it's remarkable. If you see them like sort of strutting around, acting very arrogantly on their own, the moment that Vladimir Putin enters the room, they're like small children. They're all terrified.
And we saw that in that press that filmed conference with the head of the FSB and all the other advisors.
These are people that pull people's fingernails out and with their poke their eyes out with their bare hands, and they were all behaving like these frightened children in front of Vladimir Putin. And so my conclusion, and I may be wrong about this, nobody really knows, but my conclusion is that Vladimir Putin is looking around at all different types of betrayal that could happen, and there's no way that any of these guys would ever have the guts to stand up to him, because they'd have to all do it together, and the moment that anyone had a conversation with anybody, that would be it, and they'd all be taken out to the gulag and shot.
Because you always have to think, well, who's going to start that conversation?
Exactly, and Putin is looking for that. He's waiting for that. He is wiretapping them all. I mean, they don't know. They know that they'll die if they have that conversation, and so I just don't see it happening.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much. Let's go to Andy in Stoke Newington. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Ian. Hi. Thanks for taking my call. What I wanted to ask is, what do you think the oligarchs? What hold do you think that they've got over our UK government? Why our government isn't responding the way that they are?
Because it's simple to make that connection, isn't it? Sort of we're slower, and there's much more Russian money in London, so therefore there must be some hold that they've got over the government.
Well, the logic is kind of right, and there's probably some plausible excuse as well. And so on one hand, so for the last 25 years. So London or London is to Russia like Hong Kong is to China. It's the place where everybody comes, and the Russians particularly love it here because for as uncertain and dangerous and as Russia is, where their property is at risk, they can come here. It's mostly safe, other than one or two horrible examples. The property rights, rule of law. And the best part for the Russians is that there's no law enforcement here, so nobody is going to ask any questions. And so they've all come here en masse. And the money has been flowing. There's been an immense amount of money flowing. All sorts of people are getting rich. There's estate agents and solicitors and restaurateurs and jewelry people. And these people have some sway over the conversation, over the policies. And for a long time, it was just, let's not rock the boat. Now, and so I think up until now, there has been a strong sort of, I would argue, sort of, bribing of the establishment to make this to not be tough on Russia, and I had to face this for many years as I was trying to create consequences.
When you say bribing, now the traditional meaning of that word, I suspect, is not quite what you intend.
Well, no, it is, and let me just put it out there: is there are members of the House of Lords who are put on the payroll of of people connected to the Putin regime specifically to weaken the resolve of sanctions and other things.
No, but bribing traditionally means money changing hands. So you give an MP money to do something. I mean, is that the accusation that you're making?
Well, I mean, okay. So if they've given a member of the House of Lords money to do something, so what do you want to call it? I mean, is there a better word? I'm happy to hear it, but let's call it influencing, using money to influence people in positions of power here in the UK.
But that sort of happens with all parties in the House of Lords. The House of Lords is not the government.
Yes, that's correct.
How does it affect? I mean, Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister. He has ministers who are responsible for financial regulation. Is the accusation here that they're slowing up on dealing with the oligarchs because somehow the Prime Minister or his government are under the influence of these oligarchs?
No, I don't think so. And I mean, the amount of money that's gone to the Conservative Party is de minimis compared to the threat to our national security. And I'm sure that they're all acting totally appropriately. What's the delay? It's just, getting bogged down in bureaucrats and civil servants and people who don't want to take any risk. And, it's what, we're all, screaming for scalps here. And then there's going to be somebody in the government that's going to have to put the name on the sanctions list, and then they're going to have to show up in court to defend it.
But the Prime Minister has a lot of power. The Prime Minister, if he wants something to happen, he can make it happen. Why isn't he making it happen?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that he wants to make happen that don't happen. I mean, he's definitely not all powerful, and particularly when it comes to like making people, do things. I've seen it. I've been living here for more than 30 years, and I've seen so many policies where the members of parliament bang the tables saying, this is outrageous. And then the government says, well, of course, you're right, it's outrageous. And then they say it should be fixed. And then it doesn't get fixed. And I mean, I listen to your show and other shows, and all we talk about is how nothing gets fixed around here. It's just, it's disastrously, disconnected between intention and reality.
George on a tweet says, political donations are bribes in all but name. Donors don't do it out of the kindness of their hearts. You are right in some ways, but having had to deal with political donors in a previous incarnation, I can actually tell you that most of them do it for genuine philanthropic reasons. Just because you give money to a political party does not in itself mean that you want something in return. Now, there will be bad apples in those donors. There always are. But don't think that every single donation is because someone wants something. Do you have any sympathy with that point of view, Bill?
Well, I mean, that might apply to good-hearted British people, but it doesn't necessarily apply to Russians who come here who have the opportunity to make political donations. It's a cynical bunch, the Russians who come here, and they're doing this for a reason.
Okay. Let's go to Anne in Preston. Hello, Anne.
Hello, Ian. Yes, it's a simple question, really. Why are all Western businesses still operating in Moscow? I've only focused on Moscow as an example. There's at least 10 McDonald's, there's don't know how many Costa Coffees, there's all that we see in the UK as drive-ins. I don't know who owns them. Are they American concerns? Are they Russian oligarch franchises? But they're all paying 13% tax to the Russian government to fund the war. But that's a very simple example of they're still operating, they're still there, they're still...
Well, bear in mind, Anne, we're only 2 weeks into this war so far. I think everybody's expecting everything to happen like immediately. If you are a major corporation like Coca-Cola, and I think I read on Twitter earlier, they have decided now to come out of Russia. I may be wrong on that, but stand to be corrected. But to expect everything to happen in 2 weeks, Bill, I mean, it's unrealistic, isn't it?
But she's right. I mean, she's right. If we're in a true existential crisis where, we watch, here in your studio, I'm watching the TV out of the side of my eye where the bombs are going off and innocent people are being killed, and everybody should be acting quickly. And for what it's worth, a lot of I get an updated list of companies pulling out every day, and many, many, many companies are pulling out. Apple pulled out, BP pulled out, Linklaters, a UK law firm, pulled out. And it's really it kind of reminds me of apartheid South Africa. The way that we ended apartheid was by a total Western disinvestment campaign, and that should happen here. And I think that there should be public shaming of companies that don't pull out, because it's anything that any company that operates there is effectively enabling Putin's treacherous genocidal war in Ukraine.
So who are the big players that consumers should be putting pressure on?
Well, some of these people you can't put pressure on, but there's a very strong reluctance by law firms, London city law firms, not to pull out. There was an article yesterday that the law firm Freshfields, and these are lawyers making millions of pounds a year. Freshfields asked the government for permission to carry on working for VTB Bank. VTB Bank is a Russian state bank that's on our sanctions list. How can they justify that? How can they show up at the school gates and look at the other parents in the eye when they're basically being paid blood money to do that? And so I think that absolutely it's a matter of not just moral imperative, but national security for everybody to stop doing business with Russia.
Jürgen on the text says, should we be concerned about the son of a KGB agent being in the House of Lords? How big a risk is it? Now, he's talking about the owner of the Evening Standard, Evgeny Lebedev, and we obviously have to be conscious of the laws of libel here.
Indeed. And I've been the victim of these libel laws because Russians have sued me here, and they love suing and love tying you up in knots. And there's an excellent podcast, and I encourage everybody to listen to it. It's called The Lord of Siberia. It's on Tortoise Media. I just listened to it yesterday, and it does a deep dive into Lord Lebedev and how he became a lord and who his father was and all the crazy stuff surrounding it. And just to avoid all these lawyers that I've just insulted coming after me, why doesn't everyone listen to that and then they can draw their own conclusions?
Well, Robbie, my producer, says he listened to it yesterday and says it's incredibly good. So we'll leave that one there, which is probably wimpy of me, but there we go. A couple of texts here. This is from Tim, actually talking about the conversation that we had. Actually, no, I'm not going to read that one out because it's not relevant to this. But this one is, Max says, great show. Would you be ready to accept that Brexit was a Russian-driven plan to destabilise Europe? I guess you won't. I'm going to put that one to you, Bill.
So Brexit was a UK plan with, there's a large part of the population, I guess 52%. But what I can say is that Brexit aligned with Vladimir Putin's interests. So Vladimir Putin is a guy who doesn't like people who are stronger than him. And so he doesn't like the United States because the United States is obviously stronger than him. And he kind of likes a lot of individual countries in Europe, but he doesn't like the EU because the EU, if people act together, is definitely stronger than him. And also for the third thing he doesn't like is NATO, same reason. And so when he saw Brexit happening, this was perfect because if he could somehow break up the European Union or break pieces off of it, that serves his natural interest, which is, in his perfect world, it would be every man for himself, and he would be, threatening some, bribing some, aligning some, going against some, and that's his perfect world. And so, and did he do things to encourage Brexit? Probably yes, I think he did. But I don't think that it was his plan. It didn't come from him that we ended up having this major policy.
Do you think that any influence that he or Russia had, either financially or otherwise, influenced the result?
It's impossible for me to say. I can imagine that they did the same thing, by the way, for Donald Trump's election in 2016, which followed Brexit. So I didn't actually expect Brexit to happen, and I was really surprised living in London because a lot of Londoners didn't want Brexit. And then when the U.S. election was coming on and everyone was saying Hillary Clinton was going to win, I was thinking, maybe not. And so I don't know whether they succeeded or not. I know that in the U.S., it's been studied very carefully by law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and they've come to the conclusion that Russia did succeed in tipping the balance and interfering in the U.S. election and having a very strong impact.
Some very, very interesting texts coming in here and lots of calls as well. We'll come back to more of them in a moment. It's 12:32 News Headlines with Simon Morgan.
The evacuation of 2 Ukrainian cities has been postponed after officials there say Russia's failing to observe its 5-hour ceasefire. It was meant to allow civilians to leave until 2 p.m. UK time, but officials say it's too dangerous. British nationals who are still in Russia are being told they should leave unless it's essential for them to be there. Earlier, the Foreign Office updated its advice to say Britons should use remaining commercial routes. And tributes continue to pour in for the Australian cricketer Shane Warne following his death at the age of 52. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said he will be offered a state funeral. The weather, a dry and sunny afternoon across the UK, some patchy rain in parts of eastern England, a high of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
Bill Browder is here taking your calls, anti-corruption campaigner. Giselle has sent in a text saying she's too shy to call in, but would very much like to discuss the company Quintessentially, a service for Russian citizens, and it's run by Camilla Parker Bowles' nephew. Well, there's a bit to unpick there. It is run by Ben Elliott, who indeed is Camilla Parker Bowles' nephew, but he's also co-chair of the Conservative Party. And Quintessentially is a sort of concierge service for rich people where I don't really know what they do, but they essentially help rich people live their lives better, I suppose. And it is thought that there are somewhere between 50 and 100 Russian clients of this company. Bill, what do you make of that? Is that a sort of bit too incestuous?
Well, let's just start with what they do for people. So Russians love luxury. They do all these terrible financial crimes in Russia, and then they want to live as large as they possibly can in the Western world. And there's no better, and they have no idea what restaurants, how to get into parties, how to get onto guest lists, etc. And so you have literally mafia figures from Russia with money who want to impress their friends, and they sign up with Quintessentially. And I'm not defaming Quintessentially because I have evidence of one particular mafia figure who was involved in the Magnitsky case, the murder, the case where my lawyer was murdered. And there was a Russian mafia consigliere who was a client of Quintessentially. And we have and his emails leaked, and so we have this unbelievable thing where we can see, they were organizing his son to go to school here. They were organizing apartments here, and he wants to rent a Porsche and all this kind of stuff. And so, they're concierges to, gangsters. And if those gangsters are, wanting to meet people, they can meet people. And so I think it's kind of a awful situation. And I guess I'd like to hear them make the announcement that they're severing all ties with the Russians.
And they haven't yet.
I don't know. I've not read it. I think I would have heard about it if they had. I'd like to hear that.
Because I suppose it is incumbent for any company to do due diligence on the people that they're dealing with. And so with that example that you've just quoted there, they clearly haven't. Or if they have, they've done it and then gone ahead anyway.
Well, I mean, it's even worse. So this guy, this organized crime figure, he wanted to bribe an official from Kazakhstan, and so he signed him up for Quintessentially and paid his bill.
Okay, well, obviously we haven't got Quintessentially side of the argument here, but that sounds an appalling thing to have done. John is a new caller in Norwich. Hello, John.
Hello, Ian. Hello, Bill. As money laundering is illegal, why aren't the property agents and the lawyers and the banks and the accountants involved in these money laundering deals being fined or jailed? And Ian, perhaps you should send a copy of your book to Putin, by the way.
Which one's that?
The Why Can't We All Just Get Along?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it'd have a lot of effect on him, to be honest, but it's a thought. Okay, yeah. Bill.
All right.
This is the most horrible thing is these enablers, these people, the lawyers, the accountants, all these types of people who are doing the money laundering and doing the reputation laundering for these Russians. And there's a whole industry of people here. There are people making millions of pounds a year doing this type of stuff. And you're right. These people should be prosecuted, should be fined, etc. And the one thing I hate to tell you, you hear my American accent, so I sound like an outsider, but I've been here 30 years and I've seen it all up close and personal, is that there is like a 99.9% chance, if you're a Russian crime figure, Russian oligarch, etc., and you've got dirty money, that no one will ever investigate you, no one will ever prosecute you, and
Why?
Certainly. There's been a policy basically not to prosecute these people.
I mean, if I sell a second-hand car and pay £10,000 in £10 notes into my bank account, they want to know where that money's come from. So if that happens to me when I'm under suspicion of money laundering for that, how on earth can someone with millions get away with it?
because they have millions. And I think that what it really comes down to is that the government doesn't want to have expensive lawyers challenging them in these cases, and so they just don't take the cases. And their excuse is if they lose the case, then they have to pay the other side's legal fees. And so they should change the law to say that, the government can prosecute anyone they want and there's no legal fees, because it's absurd that they're too afraid to take on these cases. And, if you were desperately hungry and you stole a loaf of bread, you can go to jail for a couple of years. But if you're a Russian oligarch, you're not going to go to jail, and nor will all the enablers and lawyers and everybody in between who helped you launder your money.
I mean, you've been talking about this for many, many years. Other people have too. And yet governments of both colours, this government's been in power for 12 years, so predominantly this government, but the Blair and Brown governments were similar. And they've done nothing about it. And therefore people naturally draw the conclusion that there's something fishy about it. Otherwise they would do it.
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with Labor versus Conservative. I think it has to do with just incompetence and the system. Nobody really wants to dig in, roll up their sleeves and fix it. Sometimes it takes, you could have a faulty aircraft and the pilots are complaining about it, and then the engineers are complaining about it, and no one's doing anything about it, and the airline doesn't want to do anything, and the manufacturer doesn't want to do anything about it, until the plane crashes and there's 350 dead people, and then all of a sudden there's a recall and
too late.
And that's the kind of situation we're in right now, where nobody wanted to do anything about this. Okay, we are where we are. But now we're in the plane crash situation where we have to do something about it.
Well, talking of slightly unsafe airlines, the Press Association are reporting that Russia's flagship airline Aeroflot has halted all international flights except to Belarus in the wake of Ukraine war sanctions. I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about that during the course of the day on LBC. Not that they've got anywhere to fly to at the moment apart from Belarus. Robert is in Eastbourne. Hello, Robert.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Ian. Hi, Bill. I just wanted to ask Bill his opinions on the Russian report, because it seems as if they didn't find anything because they never looked for anything.
Well, I was actually a contributor to the Russia report. I gave evidence to the Russia report, and my name is all over the Russia report.
This is the Defense and Security Committee's
right.
report.
So
the
Intelligence and Security Committee had an investigation into Russian influence in UK affairs, and they came to all sorts of interesting conclusions. I should point out that this was a report which was withheld for a long period of time by the government and also redacted in some important areas. But they came to all sorts of conclusions. For example, in America, there's something called the Foreign Agent Registration Act. That's something which says that if somebody is representing a foreign government, somebody in our country, or I should say in America is representing a foreign government, they have a legal duty to say, I'm representing a foreign government, and register with the Department of Justice. Here, you can represent a foreign government, any lobbyist or whatever, and nobody is going to know who you're representing, and you don't have to make any disclosures. I mean, that's like very basic, very simple, but one of the recommendations of the report. And there's lots of other things in that report which should have happened and haven't happened. And so it's kind of, created a lot of stir. Everyone was talking about it, and then all of a sudden it just drifted into oblivion.
Have they actually actioned anything from that report, any of the conclusions?
Well, I don't want to be so definitive because I probably need to read through the report and they say, well, actually, we did this. So, I don't want to say no, but for the most part, we still have, there is still a lot of Russians here influencing the outcome of things.
Okay, Robert, thank you. We'll have more from Bill Browder in just a few moments' time. It's 12:45.
Coming up at 1 on LBC, Andrew Pearce.
With NATO ruling out a no-fly zone over Ukraine, is the country's President Zelensky right? The West has let down Ukrainian people.
Andrew Pearce on LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
12:48. The time has really flown by this hour, hasn't it? We're with Bill Browder. If you want to follow him on Twitter, you can do so at Bill Browder. That's Browder. His book is called Red Notice, and you've got a new one coming out in about a month's time.
I do. It's called Freezing Order, and it's all about tracing the $230 million that my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, discovered was stolen in a government corruption scheme, and where that money went that led to his murder. And we discovered that money went to the highest places in the Russian government. And it's a book about money laundering, but it's I've written it as a thriller. So even for those who aren't interested in money laundering, it's a page turner.
Well, we'll definitely have you on my book club podcast for that if you'd like to do that. Right, let's continue with your questions. Celia in Dorset says, naive question perhaps, but do we assume that all oligarchs are criminals?
That's a interesting question. So if in order to be rich in Russia, you have to basically make a choice, which is do you want to join Vladimir Putin, or do you want to become poor, in jail, and in exile, I should say. And so what's happened with all oligarchs is they've had to basically pick sides. And they've joined Vladimir Putin. And when I say join Vladimir Putin, that means they do what he asks them to do. And in many cases, they become custodians of his money. They become his proxies and nominees in the West for financial transactions. They send him money for his billion-dollar villa on the Black Sea. They give him yachts and other gifts. They do things he asks them to do. And so these people might have all, started out with good hearts, but they made a choice. Their choice was, in order to keep their money, they have to basically go over to the dark side. And it's really interesting because we're seeing all these oligarchs now who are under threat of sanctions or being sanctioned. They're saying they don't agree with the war, and some of them are even speaking out saying war is bad. But I've not read a single word of a single oligarch saying that Putin is bad. And that kind of tells it all.
Okay, let's move on to David in Pinner. Hello, David.
Hi.
What would you like to ask?
I would like to ask Bill about his personal security. Since I read his book, Bill, Red Notice, some years ago, you've become one of my personal heroes. But you're living here, you've told everybody you've lived here for 30 years. Should I be worried about your personal security? I assume you're taking all the necessary precautions.
Well, I can't go. Thank you for your kind words. I can't go into detail about how I secure myself, but suffice to say that I am at risk. Putin doesn't like people who put his money at risk. I've put his money at risk with the Magnitsky Act, and he has publicly stated that he wants to get me any way he can. And I've gotten death threats. I've been given kidnapping threats. The Russians have used Interpol 8 times with red notices to try to get me arrested. They've approached the British government asking for my extradition. So they've come after me in all sorts of different ways. Thankfully, I've survived for 12 years of this conflict. But anything could happen at any day. And
does it weigh on your mind on a daily basis, or do you have a sort of slightly fatalistic approach to these things?
Well, I mean, there's not that much I can do about it, but the one thing I can do is live a meaningful life and carry on with my justice campaign. And it's more meaningful for me to go seek justice for Sergei Magnitsky, seek justice for the people of Ukraine, and to expose the crimes of the Putin regime than it would be to clam up and go into hiding, which is something I'm not going to do.
David, thank you. Bob is in Lewisham. Hi, Bob.
Hi. So just like the last caller, I'm a huge fan of Bill's. I'm a money laundering reporting officer for a bank, and I've been doing this for a long time. I had a question for Bill, which is, for some countries, we put in place broad-ranging sanctions, so like North Korea, Sudan, Syria, etc. But for Russia, for some reason, we're reluctant to do that, and we're going after, for the UK, it's a tiny population, but targeted at individuals. Any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, we're doing both. I mean, they unplugged 70% of the Russian banking system from SWIFT so they can't transact anymore. They put in place sanctions on all sorts of Russian companies and sectors. And, of course, they put sanctions on the individuals, which we've been talking about, the oligarchs. I think you're right. I mean, I think that you kind of can't do it halfway. You know, we're facing a threat where Vladimir Putin at the moment is just going after Ukraine, but I don't believe he's going to stop there. I think that Vladimir Putin, if he were to succeed in getting Ukraine and declare victory, then the next place would be Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And when he goes to those places, we have a treaty with those countries. They're members of NATO. And it's our duty to then have a head-to-head war with Vladimir Putin. And if we were to have that, he would then threaten nuclear war. And so I would argue that we should be doing everything we possibly can at this moment to slow him down, to effectively starve him of any financial resources so that he's stuck in this quagmire and doesn't ever come to us. And how can we do that? We can completely and absolutely economically surround him. And a full economic embargo at this point, I think, is justified based on what we are seeing play out in Ukraine right now. And it's not just for the Ukrainians, it's also for ourselves.
Bob, thank you. Let's go to Harry in Wimbledon. Harry, what's your question, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, my question is, I work in property and we have to do all these anti-money laundering checks all the time. But I think the system's flawed. My question is, how could you make the system better to actually make it worthwhile? Because I sort of get the feeling that it's more of a showmanship rather than any useful anti-money laundering checks.
I agree with you. It's a check-the-box exercise. They give everybody some boxes to check. They say check the boxes, and then they look the other way. It's I mean, at the moment, I think that there's a lot of different ways to fix this. One of them is to make it absolutely crucial that beneficial ownership of all companies here is public, and so that it's obvious who's behind companies. Another thing is to make Companies House accountable. If you register a company here, and you can do it for £13, and you can say anything you want. You don't ever have to. You can register a company in my name. I can register a company in your name. Nobody cares and nobody polices it. And so all sorts of bad guys are registering companies, owning properties, and you as a intermediary will never know who's behind the company. And so there has to be a complete reform of Companies House and make some type of criminal liability, and real criminal liability that's enforced, so that these Russians can't just hide behind shell companies and all sorts of layers of obfuscation.
Harry, thank you. We've only got 2 minutes left, so quick question from Lewis in Harlow. Lewis, hi.
Hiya. My question sort of follows on from your previous point of criminal liability. And basically, it's whether the legalities enable us to tax oligarchs relative to the length of the war.
Well, I've got an idea which sort of like that, which is that at the moment, when we sanction these oligarchs, we're not taking their money away. We're just freezing their property. So when you hear about these yachts in the south of France and so on being seized, they're not actually being taken away. They're just saying that they don't want them to sail into another country. But there's a next step that we could do, which is to expropriate the property of Putin's enablers after it's been frozen. And if we were to expropriate it, then the question is, who should get that money? And the obvious answer is that the victims of this horrible war in Ukraine, for reconstruction, for refugees, for everything. And that seems like a very reasonable connecting of the dots between Putin's enablers, Putin's money, and all the sanctions that are taking place right now.
Because that's not a conversation that anyone's really having at the moment, how to rebuild Ukraine, whatever the outcome of this is. Because, I mean, if Putin wins, well, obviously it's down to Russia to do it. But in effect, it'll be a country that will... Well, it's difficult to imagine how it could be rebuilt afterwards.